This video contains graphic details about a hypothetical scenario in which nuclear war unfolds. It is horrific, it is terrifying, and it is likely to give you an existential crisis. Viewer discretion is advised. Now I'm going to do something that I don't usually do on this channel. This is a new thing here on this channel, and I am going to do a book review / breakdown and talk about a scenario in which nuclear war unfolds. Now, this all started when I read Annie Jacobson's new book, Nuclear War: A Scenario, which I will have linked in the description below. I was absolutely blown away by the book, terrified. It is absolutely horrific what are in the contents of these pages, and I felt compelled to make a video to raise awareness about this issue. Now, I am no expert on nuclear weapons, nuclear physics, foreign policy, anything like that, but I have read this book twice now and taken very detailed notes throughout, and I felt compelled to make this video, sharing my thoughts and basically giving a footnotes version of what goes down in this book. This might be one of the most important books ever written. And you might be saying, well, Jake, the Bible is the most important book ever written, to which I would completely agree with you. The Bible is the most important book ever written. But if this scenario plays out like it does in the book, it could possibly mean the end of humanity. Nuclear war is no joke. Nuclear war will result in Armageddon. There is no way around it. If that happens, the Bible will cease to exist. The Quran will cease to exist. Everything humans have ever achieved, any history that has ever been recorded, could be erased. I don't want to fearmonger or spread misinformation. I don't have a political agenda here. I simply want to raise awareness about just how insane and absurd nuclear war really is. To quote the great President and General Dwight Eisenhower, as said in his farewell address,
"In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals."
That is my sole aim with this video, and really with my channel in general, is to help create a more alert and knowledgeable citizenry. Now, if nuclear war did ever break out, it is unlikely that it would play out exactly like it did in this book. There are hundreds and thousands of different scenarios and different factors at play. Who knows how it would play out, who would launch first, who would respond. But for the sake of this video, we are going to focus on Annie Jacobson's book here, and I'm basically going to give a footnotes, Cliff Notes version of what happens in this book. So the book begins with a history of nuclear weapons and the Cold War to set the stage for how we got to the present day. But everyone knows the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what happened throughout the Cold War, so I won't get into that. But it is important to note that the U.S. government, via top secret programs, have been preparing and planning for general nuclear warfare since the 1950s, right after World War II. During the Cold War, the U.S. was developing nuclear weapons at an astonishing rate, basically industrializing the production. This peaked in 1967, when the number of nukes in the U.S. arsenal peaked at 31,255. Imagine that. 31,255 nuclear weapons in the United States arsenal. That is insane. That could completely blow up the planet. Now, this number has gone down over time with de-escalation, and I believe the number for current day U.S. armed, ready-to-fire nuclear bombs is sitting at 1,770. So that is a drastic reduction, which is a step in the right direction, but it is still an absurd amount of firepower and destruction. Now, the Cold War led to a policy of deterrence, which basically is prevention. It basically says that each nuclear-armed nation will build a stockpile of nuclear weapons and vow to never use them. That's insane. All it takes is one nihilistic madman, one mad king, to fire off a single nuke, and it will result in utter Armageddon. There is no way around it. Experts have played out thousands of different war games and scenarios, and they all result in nuclear Armageddon. This brings us to present day. Now, in the book, her scenario begins with North Korea launching an ICBM, which stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, at the Pentagon, at Washington, D.C. All of this begins with a blip on a radar screen. The U.S. has a very advanced satellite system called SBIRS, which was built to detect nuclear launches and nuclear weapons. And this SBIRS satellite picks up the heat exhaust from the rocket within a fraction of a second. From there, it is complete but controlled chaos. In the book, Annie breaks down all the mechanisms and procedures in place during nuclear warfare. And there's so many acronyms for the programs and bases and bunkers and departments that it'll make your head spin. So I'm not going to get too much into that. Now, the scary thing about North Korea is their secrecy, which I think this is why she started with a launch from North Korea, because they probably are the most likely candidate for starting nuclear war just because of their unstable leadership and volatile leadership they have over there. And the scary thing about them is their secrecy. Every nuclear-armed nation alerts everyone when they conduct nuclear tests because no one wants to start nuclear war by accident. The exception to that is North Korea, who doesn't abide by those rules. When they conduct nuclear tests, they do not alert anyone. So when they launch off missiles or nuclear warheads for a test, our satellites pick that up, and we have to determine whether they are attacking anyone or just conducting a test, which is insane. It is so easy for nuclear war to break out because of North Korea and their lack of communication. So North Korea has now launched an ICBM aimed at Washington, D.C. Now, an ICBM launched from North Korea will take about 33 minutes to reach Washington, D.C. So you can imagine the complete suspense and terror and chaos that take place throughout that time. Now, once SBIRS, our satellite, picks up the heat exhaust within a fraction of a second, it works its way up through the chain of command and through all these bases and programs until the Secretary of Defense gets ready to alert the president that the United States is being attacked via nuclear weapons at approximately 3 minutes after launch. From the moment the president is notified, he has 6 minutes to make a decision on whether to fire back. 6 minutes to make a decision that will affect the fate of the world. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm going to keep that in mind when I go to vote. I think it's important that our leaders are competent and sharp so that we as the American people can have faith in our leaders to make a rational and clear decision in a moment like this. But 6 minutes is insane. I don't think there's any human on earth that can withstand the pressure of making a decision like that in such a short amount of time. Can you imagine having to make a decision like this based off of a blip on a radar screen? Now, something that's important to note is the launch on warning policy, which stemmed during the Cold War. Now, despite what some people have said, this policy is still in place today, according to Annie and her sources in the book. What launch on warning says is that if we are attacked via nuclear weapons by another nation, we will launch back without waiting to absorb the blow. Something that is also important to note is that once an ICBM is fired, or an SLBM, which is a submarine-launched ballistic missile, they cannot be recalled. Once that button is pushed, once they are launched, the decision is final. A common misconception is that we can just shoot down the nukes, right? But unfortunately, this is not the case. For instance, Russia has about 1,700 nuclear weapons, armed and ready to fire nuclear weapons. When it comes to interceptor missiles, which are the instruments that are used, supposedly, to shoot down these nuclear warheads, the United States has a whopping 44 interceptor missiles. A lot of people look at the Iron Dome in Israel and say, why don't we have that, or why can't we replicate that? But ballistic missiles are traveling at thousands and thousands of miles per hour. I believe it's 14,000 miles per hour that these intercontinental ballistic missiles are traveling at. The interceptor missiles are traveling at 20,000 miles per hour. So the scary thing is that these interceptor missiles work only 40 to 55% of the time. So you can imagine if Russia fires 1,000 nukes at us, we have 44 interceptor missiles and they work 50% of the time. So there's basically nothing we can do in terms of shooting down an incoming nuclear warhead. So in this scenario, we launch 4 interceptor missiles to counterattack the ICBM launched by North Korea, and they all fail. It is now on the president to make a decision. Now, it's important to note that in the United States, it might be different for other countries, but in the United States, the president has sole authority to launch nuclear weapons. No one can launch nuclear weapons without authorization from the President of the United States. So after he's alerted, he is ushered down into a bunker in the White House where he is presented with the single most classified document in the United States, the nuclear football. Inside the nuclear football, inside this satchel, is what one of Annie's sources calls the Black Book. This is called the Black Book because it involves so much death, and her source likened it to a Denny's menu. So it basically has a list of counterstrike options, including death tolls, targets, amounts of nukes fired, types of nukes fired, and things of that nature. During this time of deliberation in the bunker between Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Defense, the President on whether to fire back or not, North Korea fires a second nuke at the United States. And this comes in the form of a submarine-launched ballistic missile, an SLBM, off the coast of California. It is now unmistakable that North Korea is attacking the United States. Before we continue, it's important to discuss nuclear submarines, which have been likened to the name Handmaidens of the Apocalypse. These nuclear submarines are extremely stealthy. They are armed to the teeth with nukes, and one of Annie's sources said, "It is easier to find a grapefruit-sized object in space than it is to find a nuclear sub at sea." So this second SLBM, launched by North Korea, is aimed at the Diablo Canyon power plant on the coast of California. This is a nuclear power plant, so it was very strategic of North Korea to fire here because this is what is referred to as Devil's Scenario. More on that in a moment. While these two nuclear ballistic missiles are heading towards the United States, the president and his inner circle of Secret Service agents and Secretary of Defense are getting strapped into Marine One, trying to get away from Washington, D.C. as possible. Now, it's important to note that when nuclear warheads go off, when they detonate, they give off an EMP blast, which is an electromagnetic pulse. Now, this is scary because Marine One runs on electronics, and EMP blasts completely shut off all electronics. They completely black out electronics. So they pack parachutes in Marine One. So they're speeding away from Washington, D.C. in Marine One with parachutes, which they will use out of fear of the EMP blast that's going to come off from the nuke that hits the Pentagon. So back to the Devil's Scenario that I mentioned earlier. In her book, Annie describes it like this: directly attacking a nuclear reactor with a nuke is a worst-case scenario beyond measure. Nuclear weapons create fallout and radiation that dissipates over time. But attacking a nuclear reactor guarantees a core reactor meltdown that results in a thousands of years long catastrophe. So basically, if you look back at Chernobyl, which was a nuclear power plant, that is complete child's play compared to what would happen if a nuclear weapon struck a nuclear power plant. First comes the explosion, then a fire, then an uncontrollable spewing of radioactive debris. This creates a molten mass of radioactive lava that accumulates at the base of the nuclear power plant, then sinks into the earth, growing in size for about 2 years. So now, 4 minutes after North Korea launched their SLBM, it strikes the Diablo Canyon power plant, and Devil's Scenario has come to pass. Inside Marine One, after intense deliberation, the United States decides to send back 50 ICBMs and 8 SLBMs. Nuclear war is now imminent. Now, because of all the nuclear material at the power plant being blown up and exposed and spewing radioactive debris everywhere, one of Annie's sources says you'd have a situation where the middle of California is unusable forever. The land could be contaminated all the way to Nevada, perhaps even Colorado. Diablo Canyon would never recover. Now, one of the most terrifying aspects of nuclear war with North Korea is that our ICBMs have to travel over Russia to reach North Korea because they don't have the range. So Russia sees what they think are hundreds of ICBMs because their satellite technology is not as advanced as ours. They see what they think is hundreds of ICBMs coming for Russia, and they think they are being attacked by the United States. Now, back in Marine 1, unable to outrun the impending EMP blast from the nuke that's about to hit Washington, D.C., the president and his small team jump out of Marine 1 hoping to survive. They will not. The question of secession within the U.S. government now comes into question in order to maintain an operating and functioning government. At 33 minutes since the initial ICBM launch by North Korea, the nuclear warhead strikes the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and the scene is horrifying. This is what it would look like. In a fraction of a second, the 1 megaton thermonuclear bomb creates a fireball of 180 million degrees Fahrenheit, or 5 times hotter than the center of the Earth's sun. That expands at millions of miles per hour. Basically, everything within a mile of ground zero is reduced to organic powdered soot. No cellular life will remain. The intense heat from the initial blast creates a high-pressure wall of condensed air that moves out like a tsunami, destroying everything in its path. This creates winds of several hundred miles per hour. And for reference, a Category 5 hurricane, one of the most destructive forces the world has ever seen, has winds of about 150 miles per hour. So you can imagine the absolute destruction that this would create. Mega fires erupt, gas lines explode, making those fires worse. Asphalt streets liquefy, and all of Washington, D.C. is engulfed in massive flames within minutes. Over 1 million people are already dead. Within a 9-mile ring of ground zero, there are 100% casualties. Now, as the mushroom cloud starts forming, this creates an inverse suction effect, which basically sucks everything back into the inferno. So when you see a mushroom cloud, it is basically the powdered remains of people and structures and buildings and wildlife and plants. It's absolutely appalling. Now, this mushroom cloud is basically a radioactive potion of remains of people and buildings that starts spewing out over the surrounding area, creating what is known as nuclear fallout. So back in Russia, after they see what they think are hundreds of ICBMs coming at them from the United States, they launch 1,000 nuclear warheads back at the United States and at various NATO bases around the world. Global nuclear war is now unfolding. Once the US sees this, they launch hundreds of ICBMs back at Russia. Deterrence, diplomacy, foreign policy have all gone out the window, and the only focus is the complete annihilation of the enemy. At 52 minutes since the initial ICBM launch by North Korea, our 8 SLBMs that we launched back at North Korea strike the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang, and completely decimate the entire city. Millions die instantly. Now it's time for North Korea to roll out their secret mega weapon, a super EMP. For a little background, North Korea has a satellite that they claim is just to broadcast patriotic songs to their citizens. But many believe that it holds a nuclear warhead, and like we mentioned earlier, nuclear warheads give off an EMP blast when they're detonated. If you thought the nuclear explosions or the nuclear fallout was scary, wait till you hear this. In this scenario, North Korea detonates their super EMP 300 miles above Nebraska. This has the power to black out the entire U.S. power grid. There is a surge of energy, and then everything ceases to flow. All electricity and power is gone. The explosion is silent because it happened in space. There is no structural damage, yet this is quite possibly the worst case scenario. Backup generators kick on, but only for a limited amount of time, because the flow of fuel requires electricity. So only the amount of fuel they have in reserve is the amount of time that they have left, meaning the various bunkers and bases around the country. But the EMP blast isn't necessarily the true horror. it's the collateral effects. Nearly everything runs on electricity here in the United States. So here's how this would play out. Roughly 10% of cars on the road suddenly shut down, and everyone starts crashing into each other. No longer can people flee. There's pandemonium everywhere. Because the power has shut off, things like control railroad routers, lift gates on dams, gas and oil refinery transmissions, assembly lines, air traffic control, ports, hazardous material plants, and the entire defense industry all fall into uncontrolled chaos. All hell breaks loose. All types of vehicles crash into each other, elevators fall, satellites and airplanes fall from the sky. All 53 nuclear power plants begin running on generators for a limited amount of time. Millions of gas and oil lines explode. Dams burst, causing massive floods. There is no water, no lights, no hope of rescue. Sewage water floods the streets, and within minutes, disease-carrying insects swarm the waste, garbage, and human bodies. After only 55 minutes since the initial ICBM launch by North Korea, humans have been reduced to primal, mammalian hunter-gatherers resorting to savagery to survive. To quote the book here, nuclear weapons reduce human brilliance and ingenuity, love and desire, empathy and intellect to ash. And now that the US is completely powerless, has no electricity, the hundreds and hundreds of ICBMs launched by Russia start to fall on the United States and various NATO bases around the world. Now, the scale of destruction and disaster and calamity that results from this is impossible to wrap your head around or comprehend or to explain. Millions die instantly. Mega infernos are raging across the country, being worsened by all the gas and oil lines and chemical plants that have exploded and failed due to the EMP blast. Basically, the entire country is covered in mega flame infernos with millions upon millions dead. The same is the case in Russia once our nuclear warheads reach there. And just like that, World War III is over as quickly as it started, within an hour. World War II lasted 6 years. World War III is over within an hour. Millions, perhaps billions of people are dead. The world is on fire. Radioactive fallout is spewing all across the planet, and the worst is still yet to come. As Nikita Khrushchev said, the survivors will envy the dead. The megafires burning around the world produce toxic smoke because of the chemical plants that have failed or been blown up. These megafires loft billions of pounds of radioactive soot into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun and bringing us to what is called nuclear winter. All this soot that has been lofted into the atmosphere blocks out the sun, causing global temperatures to plummet 30 to 40 degrees, which could last for at least 10 years and reduce the sun's rays by 70%. In places like Iowa, for example, temperatures might not go above freezing for 6 years. Those who miraculously survived the explosions and nuclear fallout suffer severe chromosomal damage, and many will become infertile, making it even more difficult for the human race to reproduce and survive. Rainfall is reduced by 50%, causing agriculture to fail pretty much all around the world. Supply chains no longer exist. Food in storage is either contaminated by radiation or rots. Humans that may have survived this now become hunter-gatherers, searching for insects or roots to survive, but many will starve to death. On the water side of things, most freshwater bodies become completely frozen because of the plummeting global temperatures. Bodies of water not frozen are completely contaminated with radiation and the chemical waste. So many animals and humans will die from lack of water. Hurricane-level storms rage across the oceans because of the temperature change. Most marine life in coastal waters is either dead or completely contaminated with radiation. Photosynthesis stops because of the lack of sunlight, so most plant life dies. Only those in very remote areas of the world have the chance of survival. After many months, the fog diminishes and sunlight breaks through once again, but now in the form of ultraviolet killer rays. The nuclear explosions and nitrous oxides that have been lofted into the atmosphere completely destroyed more than half of the ozone layer that protects us. So humans now if there are any left, have to move underground in order to survive. As the great thawing begins, millions, perhaps billions of corpses lying around the world begin thawing and rotting in the harsh sun. First, there was famine and cold. Now there is killer sunlight, pathogens, and plague. Because insects are less prone to radiation, insects swarm the earth and disease runs rampant. Only time will tell if humanity will survive. It will be thousands of years before radiation diminishes and the earth heals itself and becomes normal and functioning once again. Thousands of years of progress, innovation, knowledge, perseverance, ingenuity, and achievement is reduced to rubble and ash and death within an hour. If humanity doesn't survive, all that was is forgotten and reduced to remote archaeological sites if ever found. If humans do survive, we are set back thousands of years, reduced to hunter-gatherers, and the evolutionary cycle will restart. This is all an ever-present possibility. It could happen at any moment. Nuclear war could start at any moment. All it takes is one nihilistic madman, one miscommunication, one miscalculation, and it could mean the end of humanity. Humans have created the ability to destroy ourselves, and it is important to be aware and vigilant and be an alert and knowledgeable citizenry so that this never happens. I will leave you on a quote by Mr. Albert Einstein when asked about World War III. "I know not which weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Now, I know this was a little bit different for our channel to make a video about something like this, but I felt compelled to make this video after reading her book because I think it's important to be aware of these issues because that will prevent nuclear war and anything like that from happening in the future. But this was a very watered down Cliff Notes version of the book. If you want to go check out the full picture and go check out the book, that will be linked in the description below. I still have so many questions that I have after reading this book, so I'm trying to get her on the podcast, but she's a really big guest and really busy, so that may or may not be a possibility, but I'm going to try my best. I hope many of you now realize how catastrophic and devastating and insane and absurd nuclear war really is. It's truly appalling that leaders of nuclear-armed nations would flirt or even play with the idea of launching nuclear weapons. It blows my mind, and I hope that this video helped create a little more awareness about the issue so that this may never happen. God willing, if it ever does, who knows what would happen. But if you liked the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button below. Make sure to drop your thoughts about nuclear war in the comments. Make sure to check out our podcast, Up in the Corner, where we post weekly episodes interviewing best-selling authors, expert historians, and combat veterans. If you want to support the channel, our Patreon is in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on our next adventure.